How many of you here tonight believe that Marxism can never be implemented in America? You may be surprised to learn that if you ask that same question to any Cuban American grandmother, anyone that was alive in Cuba in the 1958, in the lead up to the revolution, they would tell you that they never thought that that could be implemented in Cuba. In fact, we were the most Americanized country in Latin America. When we told Venezuelans 20 years ago that Venezuela was becoming socialized, they balked at it. They said we were crazy. They said that because of our experience, we were exaggerating the situation, that they were different. They had oil. And yes, they could veer a little bit to the left, but the United States would never allow that to happen. Yet it happened. Today, when Venezuelans go around, they warn everyone the same way that we warn them. You see, no one ever thinks that this could happen in their country. There are always logical reasons why it can't happen here. So the question today that I want to pose for you is, can it happen in the US? We are different after all, aren't we? Well, let's explore that together. For the last 60 years, Cuban Americans have been warning the US that organized cultural Marxism has been hard at work in the United States of America, and that it is increasingly on the rise. This is not something that started last year or the year before. In return, we have been insulted and vilified by the mainstream media, or at least by those outlets that have been taken over by the cultural Marxists that we talk about. Unfortunately, today, that represents most of our media in the United States. In fact, Cuban Americans are about the only minority group which those media outlets feel that it's not only okay and acceptable to attack, but part of their mission. Just last week, the congressman from this city, from Orlando, Darren Soto, asked the FCC to squash the First Amendment rights of Cuban Americans in Miami and to regulate what they can say or what they can hear. That the purchase of a radio station by myself, together with my ownership of a local television station, is dangerous. That this should not be allowed because we confuse older Cuban Americans, immigrants, into voting Republican. That they need to be protected from certain ideas. Now think about that. Fact is, this is obviously extremely insulting and racist, to say the least, about Cuban Americans, and saying that Hispanics cannot decipher the truth for themselves, that somehow they must be protected from certain ideas. Certainly Darren Soto and the growing socialists within the Democratic Party is basically saying that it's okay to seek institutionalized discrimination against Cuban Americans because we don't agree with them, that our ideas are dangerous, irrational, and a poison to the marketplace of ideas. Now, can you imagine if a Republican congressman were to make a similar statement, say about black-owned television stations, that because African Americans tend to lean Democratic, they somehow must be regulated, they must be protected, because the rest of us could decipher for ourselves, but they can't. That comment would immediately and correctly be identified as outlandish and racist. But this reason, while real, it's less important to us because, quite frankly, in our community, we have never given in to the concept of victimhood or the idea that America is institutionally racist because it once, part of it was. That's not our concern. Our concern is that Soto's actions are fundamentally Marxist, anti-democratic, and un-American, yet increasingly tolerated by the Democratic Party in the face of increased support for the growing socialist bloc within that party. Not that long ago, this kind of behavior would have been unthinkable. Mainstream Democrats themselves would have been calling for his resignation. Today, however, they tolerate it because they prefer to go with the flow than take a principled stance. Of course, they're not alone. Republicans do this as well. And therein lies the problem that Cuban Americans have been warning and highlighting for all these years, that Marxism, coordinated, organized Marxism, is growing in America. and that it's now going mainstream, especially because both parties are letting it happen. My friends, this attack on America has been undergoing for quite some time. Only this attack is less visible because it doesn't come in the form of rocket fire. It comes as a deliberate cultural attack unleashed by Marxists, in many cases with the coordinated effort and sometimes uncoordinated support from places like Moscow, Beijing, and Havana. It was Khrushchev who said in the 1960s that Marxism was already here in America, and that in time we would be so weakened morally, spiritually, and economically that our surrender to Marxism would be voluntary. That wasn't just talk. That was a plan. There is a manual that these cultural Marxists follow, one played out in Cuba and in Venezuela and so many other countries that they have enslaved all over the world. The cultural Marxist plan, which began with their founding father, a gentleman by the name of Antonio Gramsci, proposed that Lenin and Stalin had it all wrong, that the best way to defeat America isn't militarily or economically. See, Gramsci believed that that was impossible. The best way to destroy America was to destroy its culture from within, to place their promoters in positions of influence in key sectors of our society, including education, media, and a number of others. They then use these positions to divide and target the country by criticizing every major institution. They don't propose that we go for socialism, they criticize our institutions. Church, school, marriage, historical figures, and they then create divisions by exploiting real problems and creating coalitions or factions within our society to further fragment it. That might sound familiar to you, but I had to tell you, it's not a uniquely American experience, let alone a homegrown one. This was Gramsci's prescription, and it's exactly what Khrushchev was talking about. It's something that has been done time and time again, successfully, all over the world. I know because it happened to us in my country of birth. The success of the cultural Marxists lie in that they make increasing demands gradually, and the majority often concedes one by one to each of the demands, as we have been doing here in America on both sides of the aisle for far too long. This continues until there is nothing else left for us to concede, or until they feel empowered enough to reveal their true intentions. Now, some particularly well-meaning friends on the left say that that's all fine, but in the US, this is not really a threat, that this really only happens in poorer countries where there's a big divide between the rich and poor. This concept is a mistake that too many on that democratic left have made all over the world and left them at their own demise. See, liberals, in the democratic sense, are antiseptical to Marxists. They see them only as useful idiots to be manipulated and later discarded. For there is no room for liberals in Marxism. There is no room for minorities, for dissent of any kind. Fact is that Marxism advances not when there's poverty or a difference in wealth. It advances where the traditional parties do not perform, where there is corruption, where institutions are weakened, and perhaps more relevant for us today, where those who govern have forgotten that power is a means and not an end. In 1958, Cuba ranked third in the world in TV sets per capita. Its GDP per capita was higher than Italy's and higher than Spain's. We had a highly educated population with a strong middle class. We had more doctors per capita than the United Kingdom. Havana, in many ways, was what Miami is today. Yet we fell to Marxism. By contrast, when Castro sent Che Guevara to Bolivia, the poorest country in the Americas, the peasants that he was there to liberate, save, and enlighten turned them over to Cuban American CIA officer Felix Rodriguez. And that, my friends, was the end of Che Guevara. Thank you. So then how exactly does this happen in a society with such a strong middle class? Well, Castro, like some of our leaders today, didn't come to power on a Marxist platform. In fact, right up to the last breath of Cuba's democracy, he insisted that his mission was to respect Cuba's democratic constitution and provide for a new representative democracy. Those were his words. And that allowed a lot of well-meaning folks to support him. But as soon as he took power, he used the fervor of the moment, the promise of this new democratic beginning, to ask that all guns be collected. It seemed reasonable. There was a lot of gun violence at the time in Cuba, and so people complied. And soon thereafter, he began vilifying, trying, and imprisoning anyone who had been part of the prior government at any level, and anyone, more importantly, who had been friendly to them. Even actors and celebrities who were seen as sympathetic to any old political figure suddenly lost their roles in the public light or in television. So you see, this concept that we're seeing today in America of the cancel culture is certainly not new. It is an old Marxist strategy that we have seen before. Here in America, it just has a new name in a new time. Castro then quickly moved to take control of the businesses. First, he went after American businesses, and large Cuban businesses did not complain. Then he went after large Cuban businesses, and the middle class did not complain. Then he went for the banks, the schools, and eventually the churches. And by the time the majority of Cubans had woke to the situation, Castro had declared that he was, in fact, a Marxist-Leninist and had been so his entire life. He then proceeded to nationalize all remaining businesses and any thoughts of election, and there was nothing anyone could do. Sure, thousands of Cubans rebelled, but they were killed by the thousands. We learned the hard way that, in fact, Marxism is a system that you can voluntarily embrace, but once you do, you cannot voluntarily replace. Having to kill thousands to consolidate their power is not an issue for them. In fact, it's part of their manual. They know that in the final stages of their plan, people will rebel and they will have to be put down. They expect it. Now, in the US, we're nowhere near that. And hopefully we will never get there. But that depends uniquely on whether we have the courage to ask our elected officials to stop acting like politicians and start behaving like leaders. Now, I said earlier that this was an issue for both parties, and that when both parties fail is when Marxism sets in. Well, let me start with the Democrats. In the wake of the protests of 2020, many Democrats didn't just fail to object, but actually joined the bandwagon of the Marxist-left BLM organization. Certainly, BLM chose its name, as Marxists often do, so that anyone opposing them could be branded as someone for whom black lives don't matter. But rather than meet that challenge and tackle that issue, too many calculated, I think incorrectly, to ride the wave, even if it meant empowering a Marxist-led organization, which eventually took in hundreds of millions of dollars, money that has since been used to unseat the very Democrats that enabled them. In New York, you saw Democrats like Eliot Engel lose his seat. Engel was particularly targeted because he was one of the few remaining Democrats that led the fight against Marxism unabashedly anywhere in the world. Right here in Florida, where the state is decided by just 1% of the vote. We're a swing state. Cuban Americans are 6% of the population, or the vote. We are 3% of the population, but we make up 6% of the voting bloc because we vote. Thank you. In this last election, 70% of Cuban Americans voted for the Republican candidate, even though, thank you, even though less than 40% are registered Republican. That means that President Trump had to take along a lot of Cuban American independents and a lot of Cuban American Democrats to get to that 70%. So you would have thought that the Biden administration would have taken the opportunity, the unprecedented opportunity that presented itself this July 11th, when the Cuban people decided to undertake an unprecedented, a massive uprising against the dictatorship. You surely would have thought that had Biden taken a strong position, he could reverse the electoral tide. It made every political sense in the world. After all, every Democrat that breaks 40% of the Cuban American vote tends to win the state. Makes sense until you consider the fallout that he would receive from the Marxist side of that party. And that tells you all. Rather than consolidate their power, Democrats have consolidated the power of Marxists within their party. The party of Lyndon B. Johnson, one of the fiercest fighters of Marxist ideologies, is now the party of Bernie Sanders, a Marxist who honeymooned in Moscow in the height of the Cold War. The party that once embraced Martin Luther King's dream of a colorblind society has exchanged that for the proponents of critical race theory, modern racial segregation, and Antifa apologists. Biden's own nominee for Treasury Secretary, Saul Omarova, participated in a Marxist Facebook group as recently as 2019 and is now proposing that we nationalize all our banks. But friends, the Democrats are not the only ones to blame. Too many Republicans, fearful of the cancel culture, have failed to speak out. Some of them even go along for the ride, hoping to be accepted by this media or to fly under the radar. They calculate and proll every decision, every situation, to avoid political danger, even when they believe the discourse of action is in itself disgraceful. Well, I will remind you that it was Alexander Hamilton who said that a nation that prefers dishonor to danger is prepared for a master and deserves one. And if we continue to elect leaders that prefer dishonor to danger, we will certainly be on that path. My message to them and to the Democrats is simple. If we allow the cancel culture to take shape, then none of you will be safe. Now, some of our elected officials take a different approach. They believe that if we make some concessions, if we meet in the middle, then we will avoid conflict and help heal our society. Each time our elected officials, you and I, in the private conversations or in public forums, concede for this purpose, to keep the peace, to avoid the fight, we are in effect, however, inviting a much greater fight that will surely come if we continue on this course. You see, Marxism isn't searching for a middle ground. They aren't searching for only one thing, and that is our total destruction. Each request by them, under the guise of some group with a genuine grievance, is in their playbook just one further step to advance their goal. They begin by asking us, for example, to tear down the statues of Robert E. Lee, as they already have. And to keep the peace, many on both sides will concede and say, well, he was, after all, a rebel to the Union, so if it means that much to the other side, why not concede? But once you do that, they will, as they already have, ask you to tear down these statues of Ulysses S. Grant, who actually fought to end slavery. And if you concede there will come a time when they will ask you to shun the Founding Fathers, our very Constitution, until there is nothing else to defend. That is their ultimate goal. Make no mistake about it. It always has been. We are to Marxists what Israel is to Iran. They will stop at nothing but our destruction. Thank you. President Reagan said it best when he said that the only way to really achieve that peace in our society, in the face of this enemy, the only way to avoid these conflicts and put them behind us, and it's something that we could do right now, we could do today, is to surrender. In this case, to surrender American history, American culture, to surrender all of our icons, to abandon our spirituality, to abandon it until there is nothing more left for us to abandon. And this, my friends, is the real choice that you and I have, that Republicans and Democrats have. Do we abandon this great cultural legacy that has been the best invention in the history of mankind? Do we cower in the face of foreign enemies who push on us the Marxism because it justifies their dictatorial ambitions? Because the very existence of America is a reminder to those that they govern that there is a better way to live, that free men and women can do more and achieve more than those who live under tyranny? Or do we begin to stand up for ourselves, to do what we know in our hearts to be right, in our minds to be right, to ask our elected officials to do the same? Well, Cuban Americans, we know all too well the price to be paid for not doing so, and not doing so at this moment. We know, moreover, and more importantly, that this, right now, is it. America is the final frontier in this battle. When Marxism took over our island, we had a place called America to escape to. But if Marxism takes over America, where will any of us go? Where is there left to go? This, my friends, is the last stand on earth, and in this, the second coming of the Cold War. And make no mistake, we are entering the second coming of the Cold War. We are the vanguards of liberty for all of humanity. Destiny has put us in this place. And if we get it wrong, if America is lost, we will plunge the world into 1,000 years of darkness. That is why, when so many Americans were figuring out how not to go to Vietnam, Cuban Americans were trying to figure out how to enlist and volunteer. This is why when so many in our community heard about wars in forgotten places like Africa and Central America, people who were lawyers, construction workers in our community left their jobs to join those struggles. That's why so many doctors in our community have left the comfort of their private practice to join the Miami medical team and go into the middle of these war-torn countries to provide medical aid to freedom fighters all over the world. We get it because we've lived it. Fortunately, however, we're not alone. There are many Americans of Vietnamese descent, of Korean descent, of Chinese descent, Americans who escaped the Soviet bloc, who have also lived it. Next time you're in DC, I invite you to go and visit the Victims of Communism Foundation. Hear their stories. And if you're in Miami, I ask you to come and visit the museum that I chair, the American Museum of the Cuban Diaspora. Hear our stories. One thing you will note when you compare these stories is that they're strikingly similar stories. We face the same enemy, and it's why we can recognize him so clearly when he presents his face today in America. He can't fool us. We see right through. Ultimately, what we are facing is a continuation of the timeless struggle between good and evil. And it is up to us to take individual and collective responsibility for our actions and our share of this war. If not, we will all face the dire consequences of not doing so. Now, this is not just talk. I recently took some of this advice onto my own life. When I was asked to serve on the board of MiamiDade College, the largest college in the United States, with over 150,000 students. This is an institution that at the time continued to have a Chinese-financed Confucius Institute. MiamiDade College was also in the process of finding a new president, and the leading candidate that was sort of being fixed on us was none other than the chair of the Confucius Institute. Before I even took office, a fellow board member, a Republican, someone who knew me and knew that I liked to fight, pulled me aside and said, let's not make a fuss about this, at least not until the respected outgoing president leaves. This is the man that had brought the institute to the college. In fact, if I voted for the proposed new president, perhaps they could make a deal and find a way to usher out the institute. This certainly would have been the politically expedient thing to do, and it certainly would have endeared me to a very prominent fellow Republican and to the newly president of a powerful college. But my friends, it would have been the wrong thing to do. It would have put in America's largest college someone that, while acting in good faith, would still be willing to make these concessions to the cultural Marxist. So instead, I spoke out against the institute, against the candidate, and sure enough, I was vilified by the mainstream media, often with outright lies. Truth was no objection to them. Even Governor DeSantis was harshly criticized for appointing me to the board. But in the end, the institute was closed, and we found a new qualified president to lead the way. Now, to be sure, I paid a price, without a doubt. But to the people in my community who know better, I was a hero. And more importantly, I felt I did the right thing. I was at peace with myself. And that's the challenge that I pose to all of you today. Speak up. Don't go with the flow. Resist even when your fellow Republicans refuse to do so. We must not concede, we must not retreat, for if we do, if we fail, there will be nowhere else to go, and there will be no one left to warn. Thank you. Thank you.